Hi, welcome to English Academy 101. My name is Michael, and I'm here to help you with your English learning journey. Today, we are going to be learning about intensifiers. In English, you can use several words to intensify the meaning of a phrase. In other words, they help you make the meaning of your sentence stronger. Some of the most common intensifiers are so, such, to, and enough. In today's lesson, I'm going to help you better understand these words and show you how you can use them. So, a common intensifier in English you can use is so. It means very. It can go before an adjective or an adverb. So plus adjective. It is so cold today. In other words, it is very cold today. It is so cloudy today. In other words, it is very cloudy today. It is so hot. In other words, it is very hot today. So plus adverb. I have so much work to do today. In other words, I have very much work to do today. You can run so quickly. In other words, you can run very quickly. You eat so slowly. In other words, you eat very slowly. Such. Similar to so, the word such also means very. It can go before an adjective or a noun. Such plus adjective. They are such a nice family. In other words, they are a very nice family. She is such a beautiful child. In other words, she is a very beautiful child. We had such a good time at the park. In other words, we had a very good time at the park. Such plus noun. You are such a genius. In other words, you are very much a genius. You are such a jock. In other words, you are very much a jock. He is such a teacher. In other words, he is very much a teacher. To. The word to means a lot of something. However, it is usually used in a negative manner. It can be used before an adjective or adverb. To plus adjective. Our next door neighbors are too noisy. In other words, our next door neighbors are extremely noisy. My boss at work is too mean. In other words, my boss at work is extremely mean. That test was too hard. In other words, that test was extremely hard. To plus adverb. You walk too fast. In other words, you walk extremely fast. You are speaking too quickly. Please slow down. In other words, you are speaking extremely quickly. Please slow down. You are talking too loudly. Lower your voice. In other words, you are talking extremely loudly. Lower your voice. Enough. The word enough means having as much or as many as required. It can be used before a noun or after an adjective or verb. Enough plus noun. We don't have enough toilet paper. In other words, we don't have the required amount of toilet paper. They have enough wood for the fire. In other words, they have the required amount of wood for the fire. He has enough food for the dinner party. In other words, he has the required amount of food for the dinner party. Adjective, verb, plus enough. Are you comfortable enough? In other words, are you comfortable to the required amount? I am not sure if I have trained enough for the race. In other words, I am not sure if I trained to the required amount for the race. Have you studied enough for the test? In other words, have you studied to the required amount for the test? These useful words will help you to express yourself more clearly. Now you know what they mean, try using them the next time you speak in English. Or, if you would like, try writing some examples in the comments below. To review, remember that so means very or to such a great extent. Such also means very or to so high a degree. To means more than enough, often in a negative connotation. And enough means as much as required. If you would like some more practice with intensifiers, check out our website, EnglishAcademy101.com, where we have included some additional exercises. We have included a link in the description below. That's it for now. Don't forget to keep studying your English.